What's a myth about this war that you would like to dispel?
There's several, but the first one I'd mention is the idea that Iran is a threat, that the war was necessary in some way because Iran was a threat to the US, to the world. I think the first way to think about what's wrong with that is what the consequences have been in terms of oil. Iran has successfully cut off the supply of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, and that was not anticipated. But even with the most unanticipated consequence of the war, the actual implications of that threat are not what they're made out to be. And I think there's two reasons for that. One is that oil itself is something very different from what it was at the time of the Iranian Revolution, when the oil crisis in 1979, or even at the time of the rapid increase in oil prices that happened with other crises in the Middle East due to the interruption of supply. Most of those interruptions, of course, were caused by the US, not by the particular state. So it was the US reaction to the Iranian Revolution, or the US decision to invade Iraq in 2003 that caused those interruptions to supply. 20% of the world's oil flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Perhaps half of that has been cut because some of it can be piped out in different ways, and because Iran itself is allowing some oil out. So maybe a 10% cut. A 10% cut in the supply of oil is about the same as happened at the time of the COVID-19 crisis. COVID-19 was obviously a global crisis and had all kinds of consequences. It was caused differently because it was a collapse in demand due to the shutdowns that followed the pandemic. But the world survived. It not only survived, but for the first time, it put itself on a path to averting the worst consequences of climate crisis. So if there's a threat that comes from the Gulf, the threat is the threat of climate crisis, and the threat is the extraordinary dependence, particularly of countries like the United States, on that extraordinary supply of oil. And remember, the US consumes oil, carbon energy in general, about double the rate per capita of the next highest large industrial economies. So there is an extraordinary threat. I'm not suggesting we sort of repeat the experience of the COVID-19 shutdown, but shutdowns in the supply of oil are in themselves not the real threat that we're facing.
Of course, there's been some commentary on the environmental consequences of the heavy bombardment of Iran and toxic rain that has been pouring down, but it seems like there's been less attention to the, perhaps, would you say, sort of positive consequences of the decrease in the supply of oil?
Absolutely. Of course, those consequences have been horrific. The toxic smoke caused by the bombing of refineries and oil storage facilities, and never mind the direct loss of life and loss of livelihoods in Iran, in Lebanon. One needs to keep a focus on some of the immediate environmental and ecological consequences of warfare. But the Gulf region faces ecological consequences from global warming, from the overuse of carbon, largely by countries in the West, on a far greater scale than many other parts of the world. And in fact, those consequences are already being experienced, and they are indeed part of the crisis that regimes in the region are facing. And we know there's enormous sort of political discontent in Iran in the months both in the summer and then in the months leading up immediately to the US-Israeli war. And a big part of those are around the consequences of drought, the drought being experienced right across the region from Syria and Iraq through Iran and beyond is the worst sustained drought in perhaps 1,000 years. And the consequences of temperature rise for people living in cities in Iran, for people living in cities of the Gulf, are extraordinary. And I think it's not a question of diverting attention to the suffering caused by the war to the larger and longer term suffering that's going to be brought by the environmental crisis, but to understand how the war enables regimes, including that in Tehran, to divert attention from the kinds of problems that people are facing, whether access to water, to electrical supply, to adequate food supply. And for that reason, continue the kinds of politics and the kinds of repressive politics that actually thrive on thinking that the threat is elsewhere and is from elsewhere.
And you mentioned just now that the decrease in the supply of oil going through the Strait of Hormuz to about 10%, which you said was the same sort of level that existed during the COVID-19 crisis.
It would put us on a path towards net zero, the path we should be on to try and keep the phenomenon of global warming within the limits of 1.5 degrees.
So do you see that as as an opportunity to reflect on the kind of decrease in oil consumption that would be needed to put us on the right path? Is this a sort of opportunity to rethink our dependence on oil?
I think it is, and I think that'll happen anyway with the increased price of oil, that the incentives to switch to renewables are going to be much, much higher. Of course, in the US, the Trump administration has been doing its best to eliminate those incentives and keep the US and the world on the path of higher and higher consumption of fossil fuels. But I think, as you say, it's a question not only of particular policies or just the sort of automatic effect of higher prices. It's a matter of us reflecting on how we think about the threats that are faced in the world and not allowing the war makers to define the threats for us, whether, as people watching the war in horror from a distance or the people suffering its effects on the ground, and changing that focus to think about the problem of security in different kinds of ways, to think about how the problem of security is defined for us by people who have no actual interest in our longer term security is really important.
As a historian of capitalism, and of course you've written Carbon Democracy, a book on the history of oil, and in your most recent book you talk about the question of the future. Could you speak a little bit more about how oil functions in the present moment?
So the new book, The Alibi of Capital, tries to connect oil to a larger way of thinking about what capitalism is, and trying to show that we've sort of misunderstood capital and therefore capitalism by thinking of capital as something that is gradually accumulated from the past and then reinvested in something further going to the future, and instead to understand capital as actually a way of organizing theft from the future. And not just the sort of more general theft from the future in the sense that we're taking away a livable planet through this consumption of carbon, but in a more specific way that under capitalism, profit is made by taking some future supply and profiting in the present from devices that enable you to consume that future. Let's just talk about it in relation to oil, because I think in oil it happens in two ways. The first way, and this makes oil so different today than what it was at the time of the Iraq War, and certainly at the time of the previous major oil crises in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution or with the Arab oil embargo of 1973-74. Those embargoes or those interruptions, as I say, in many cases actually caused by the US, were interruptions to the immediate supply of oil. They weren't as serious, partly because, particularly with 73, the interruption was exaggerated because the oil companies themselves were interested in bidding up the price of oil so that they could address the threat of the producer countries in the region taking over the actual control of production. So they had to find their profits elsewhere by opening up much more expensive sites of oil production. Even today, there is an aspect of the crisis, which is the supply of physical oil, of barrels of oil. But what's different today, and has been different gradually over the last 20 years, is that almost all oil whose price is reflected in these things that you see referred to when the price of oil is up to 95 or up to 110 or up to 120, that is the price of oil futures. And oil futures are the barrels of oil that are traded on futures markets, in particular one in New York, and there's another major one in London. And
how long has that been going on for?
So the oil futures markets were invented by a man who served in the Carter administration at the time of the revolution. His name was John Treat. And he was thinking about the problems of oil supply in the wake of the Iranian Revolution, the interruption to supplies, the sanctions then imposed on Iran and so on. And he switched from the Carter and he continued in the Reagan administration, and he went to an organization in New York, the New York Mercantile Exchange, and which had previously been involved in trading potatoes, and said, we could actually trade oil on a commodities exchange. And he invented this method. So that was back in the 1980s, but it didn't really take off for at least another decade. Because it took a while to figure out the ways, and it actually depended enormously on the great deregulation of the financial industry in the US in the early 2000s, so that banks themselves and private equity firms, BlackRock and these kinds of things, could start getting involved in this kind of commodity trading, something they'd never done before. And what they could do is that they could then start buying and selling contracts for the future supply of oil. And once they did that, those contracts for the future supply of oil became almost everything that happens in the so-called global oil market. So global consumption of oil is about 100 million barrels a day. 25 times that much every day is traded on these oil futures markets. And this is an example of what I talk about in this book of assetization, of turning some future stream of revenue or some future payment, in this case, the future payment for barrels of oil in a month or 2 months or 6 months or a year, and finding ways to profit from that future. And you can do that either by simply buying it in certain ways, but you can also do it by speculating in the rise and fall of that future asset. And our life is more and more organized around that kind of process of assetization and speculation. And it's not just the banks and the private equity firms, but then the pension funds started doing the same thing. So, Vanguard and funds like this that are a major place where private pension funds are invested started doing. And that becomes part of what's actually being traded in oil. And I think that is important for understanding the current crisis, because the preoccupation with the Trump administration with the price of oil, not so preoccupied that it would have persuaded them to not go on this reckless venture, but also the timing of Trump's tweets to try and affect the ups and downs. There's extraordinary money to be made, not from producing oil, but from speculating in the rise and fall of its price, which, as I say, is 25 times the amount of money made from the actual selling of physical barrels of oil.
There are people who are obviously invested in this price speculation in a way that wasn't the case prior to the Iraq War.
Yeah, I mean, the futures market goes back, as I say, a little bit before that, 20 years before that. It's founded after the Iranian Revolution. But it's slow to get going because the big oil companies didn't want to have the pricing of their eventual sales of actual barrels handled by speculators. And even more so, as more and more production was in the hands of national oil companies in the producer countries, they didn't want these speculators to be the ones who are determining the price of oil. But gradually they came on board, and as that happened over the course of the 90s, and then at the same time, as I mentioned, in the 2000s, the banks and the investment funds could get involved, then it takes off. So it's been around, but it really takes off from the early 2000s. And it's part of that vast sort of speculative bubble that then produces the 2008 financial crisis, because that's often associated with the subprime mortgage crisis in the US, but it's actually just as much, perhaps more associated with the bursting of an oil speculative bubble that's created by that. So that's much more something of the last 20 years.
So to go back to this idea of Iran as a threat and how that sort of ties into the question of oil, the purchasing of arms, the creation of durable futures, which is something that your work sort of centers on. Could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Right. So I've been talking so far about the sort of speculative side, but there's another side to it, which is the actual producing and selling of the oil. And this has a similar history going back to the 70s, to the Arab oil embargo of the early 70s, to the Iranian Revolution of 79, which resulted in these incredible jumps in the price of oil that transferred so much more of the oil revenues to the producer states in the Gulf, Iran, and then later Saudi Arabia and the smaller Gulf producers. And that was a problem for the United States, but also an opportunity, because the increase in price allowed U.S. oil companies to start producing much more expensive oil in other parts of the world and therefore continue to build oil consumption as against the early warnings already being made there about the dangers of excessive dependence on fossil fuels. But it was also a problem because if these extraordinary sums of money are now flowing to producer countries in the Gulf, that is, say, the US dollars being used by the purchasing countries, the oil purchasing countries, largely the large industrialized countries, what do you do with that money? And that's a problem, but also an opportunity, because the large banks, particularly the American banks that are always involved in oil trades and other parts of the global trade, say, well, we now know that these oil producer countries are being guaranteed this future income over the next 5, 10, 20 years or more. And we can start lending against that future income. Mm-hmm. And the banks will then profit enormously from the credit they create and what they charge for the fees and the interest they charge on that credit. And the other people who will profit are the people who the banks then enable those producer countries to spend their money on. And some of that is just spent on consumer purchasing and some of it is spent on construction. But by far the largest and most attractive way of spending that money is to spend it on arms. And so one gets this system of sort of recycling set up where the West in particular spends more and more money on oil that now ends up in the hands of the producer countries rather than in the hands only of the international oil companies. And those producer countries commit the future spending of oil revenue, not just the current year's income, but the future spending, to the purchase of arms at the scale of initially hundreds of millions and eventually of billions. Initially Iran under the Shah, which begins to arm itself on an extraordinary scale. And the Nixon administration not only helps sort of orchestrate that first oil price increase, but orchestrates what comes to be known as the Nixon doctrine, that we should be arming these countries, starting with the Shah, on an extraordinary scale. And then after that, Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, and in parallel, Israel, because Israel starts to say, well, establishes this principle that our own arms have to be at least equivalent to those of all the surrounding Arab states. So you get this extraordinary expenditure on arms. Israel, it's provided by USA, but the others are spending their future oil revenue on the purchase of arms.
Are these arms used to maintain the status quo within these states? Are they used for repression? What happens when
on the whole, they're not directly used for repression because these states that want to repress their population, which they do in many cases, particularly at moments of uprising or revolt, they need policing equipment and they need prisons and they need a very different kind of weaponry that is a minor expense compared to what they're spending. No, these arms are given according to a series of threats, and the threat changes because what you need is a sense of a threat. So initially in the 60s, late 60s and early 70s, it's the Soviet Union, and that threat can be expanded once you've helped draw the Soviet Union into a war in Afghanistan by funding the Mujahideen. And then it begins to switch and it becomes the threat of Iraq, the threat of Saddam Hussein, and you organize that threat typically either around weapons of mass destruction, the alleged plans to develop nuclear or other weapons, or the threat of terror. The underlying principle is that you have to construct a threat. You have to construct a threat that is going to justify, and whether the threat is communism, whether the threat is terror, whether the threat is WMDs, the idea is the Gulf is a region of extraordinary threat, and that's why these unprecedented levels of arms have to flow to it in order to protect against a threat that constantly has to be remanufactured, has to find new objects as it shifts from communism to terrorism to weapons and so on, so that you can keep this process going, and so that you can keep the process of extraordinary dependence on fossil fuels going, which then cycles through the arms. So you've got this relationship between fossil fuels and arms that becomes central to the US mode of relating to the region.
And of course, I imagine some of those arms end up in places like Sudan. from the Gulf.
Yeah,
So I was thinking the UAE's support of the RSF in Sudan,
yeah,
and the way in which
exactly.
drone warfare has become one of the main ways in which violence is perpetrated there. I wonder if that's also part of the same circuit.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You started off with sort of what's the big myth. Who is it who has been constructing an entire way of seeing this region as a place of threats and threats to the West? And what is the history of that kind of threat production that keeps this system of dependence on fossil fuels and ever expanding expenditure on arms keeps it going?
How do you understand claims that Iran is trying to bring to an end American hegemony through attacking the petrodollar regime?
I think there's something to that. Iran is prevented from dealing in any easy way in dollars because it's subject to this sanctions regime and has been ever since the Islamic Revolution. And that sanctions regime was vastly expanded at different stages, and most recently under Trump, was sort of total sanctions. And the US is able to do that, not in the old way, because in the old way, when regimes were sanctioned, for example, apartheid South Africa, if you didn't want them to have oil or export things, you actually sort of had to physically blockade ports just about and try and prevent those flows. But the US doesn't have to do that in the same way anymore, because what it controls is not the global economy, but the global transactions in dollars. And so sanctions are now imposed through the US Treasury, sanctioning any bank, any financial entity, any business that accepts dollars that are connected with one of the regimes it is sanctioning. So the US has developed unilaterally this extraordinary power of sanctioning. So it would make sense for Iran, obviously, to trade its oil with countries that will exchange for payments other than in dollars, and in that way, indeed, to undermine the system that oil is purchased and is traded almost exclusively in dollars, which operates as an enormous subsidy to the United States government, because all that has to go through US banks and through the very finding of ways to access dollars. So if you're any country in the global south, you have to import oil, and in order to import oil, you have to find a way to get dollars. So and that means you're looking for ways to sell things to the US and so on. So there is a very important aspect of this war, that if there was a way to sort of de-dollarize the oil trade, to move it out of this exclusive dependence on the dollar, that would be beneficial in helping to democratize a little bit this power of sanctioning that at the moment is extraordinarily concentrated in the powers of a single government, that of the US. Even though the UN sometimes comes in on board with the imposing of sanctions, but not always, it couldn't do it itself. It can only do it through the US Treasury. So this would be a good thing. I'm sure it's something Iran would like to see. Whether that will be an outcome of this, I'm a little more dubious about.
So you said there are several myths about the war in Iran that you'd like to dispel. Are there any other myths that you'd like to draw our attention to?
It's difficult in a short conversation to do justice to them. I think the other one that would be interesting for us to talk about is the idea of Iran as a theocracy. And the sort of notion of Iran as a theocracy, and that's why it's a threat, is what one has to think about. So we've sort of dealt with the fact that thinking about it as a threat is itself problematic. But it's a threat because it's a theocracy is, I think, equally misleading. Now, Iran has a very interesting structure of government, which is sort of divided into two halves. One half that one could call the sort of more civilian half, that where elections take place, with all the extraordinary limitations on freedom of political participation and the oppressive role of the regime in narrowing the ability of people to participate in those elections, but still producing a parliament and producing a system of government through a somewhat familiar process. And then a set of parallel institutions, which might be the part that's sort of referred to as a theocracy, under the control of people whose background tends to be in forms of religious legal training, and attempt to impose on policies and legislations a set of principles that they draw out of a different intellectual and religious tradition. And it's interesting to think about that and how that works, the kinds of arguments that are developed in that half of the order. But I think it's equally interesting to think about that separation, because I think most political systems have some kind of separation, and particularly ones that think of themselves as more democratic and more open, where some things are
or more secular,
the way some things are sort of under the control or open to debate and democratic decision making, and other things aren't. And how does that division work? And I'm not saying that, I don't want to suggest that, the United States is a theocracy and Iran isn't, but I am interested in the way certain aspects of the political system is always set up so as to preserve some areas as sort of not open to forms of either more secular or more open political debate, as opposed to the forms that are closed off or are subject to other kinds of debates. And so I think, to take a rather sort of simplistic example, in the United States, there's wide debate about a lot of issues, but there are other issues, and one could think, for example, of the entire scale of corporate power and corporate control over people's lives, the power of monopolistic corporations that gets larger and larger, which is largely immune to debate. We don't think of that as where the problem of democratic forms lie and have to be contested. And we don't think of, in particular, the way that one of the things that protects is an unbelievably large expenditure of US public funds on war making and arms purchases and arms manufacture. And that's kind of almost sequestered from debate. It does get voted on, perhaps, by Congress, but not with a debate. I mean, in fact, when even administration puts in a request for even larger military budgets, Congress says, oh, well, let's make that even bigger for you. So there's a certain way in which you organize political discourse. So some things are open to debate and others are not. And I think it would be more helpful to think about the Iranian system in parallel kinds of ways. What is open to debate and what is not? And one of the ways that division works is not just the division between, if you like, a more sort of secular side of the political order and one that is more subject to forms of religious or moral or religiously legal authority, but that what's sort of sequestered there is some of the most lucrative forms of the country's economic life.
And so how does that work in the Iranian context?
Well, it means that the country's arms spending and the country's arms industry, on the one hand, which, as we know, has expanded enormously, but also the country's oil industry and its oil revenues, which have also been extraordinary, are actually under the hands of the groups that are on that sort of other side of the political order. So they're in the hands of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, of other, and their hands of very large sort of corporate-like bodies that are not directly under the control of the parliamentary system, but rather under this system of alternative legal bodies and legal. So that means you can sort of keep all this spending on arms and on all this income from oil in that other half of the government. And I like to think of how that is somewhat sort of parallel to the ways in which certain kinds of corporate power, certain kinds of military spending in the US is also sort of sequestered from the more open sides of the political system. And what that means, of course, is that you've then got a regime, in the case of Iran, that is going to benefit from the sense that the country is under threat. And the country is constantly under threat from the plans of the US and of Israel to overthrow it. Now, the difference between the way the US produces threats to itself in the Gulf and the way the Iranian regime produces those threats is that Iran gets an awful lot of assistance from the US and Israel in making those threats real. So they really can say, we are actually at threat, under threat of regime change, of attack, of war, and so on. So that reproduces a regime that wants to organize its political life over that separation between what is open to debate and what is completely not open to debate, is under these other kinds of religious political authority, and that so that military threat strengthens the repressive side of the Iranian regime.
What I hear you saying is that the term theocracy can be obfuscating of some of the similar ways in which politics comes to be sequestered from democratic processes, the involvement of ordinary political participation, and looking at the way that happens through the lens of thinking about, is it sort of regimes of extraction, the ways of organizing sort of extraction, that's what sort of demonstrate similarities between, let's say, the US and Iran.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'm not saying the two countries are equivalent, but I'm interested in all the ways in which some forms of extraordinary enrichment are protected from open political debate, and how questions of national security, questions of the need to devote extraordinary sums of money to militarization, how that is organized and justified. And I'm not saying it's the same in the two countries, but I'm saying we would understand both countries better if we thought in certain kinds of parallel ways of how those distinctions and separations are built, and that a term like theocracy is just not going to be helpful.
For those people who assert that the Iranian people need to be liberated through foreign intervention, how do you respond to them?
It was already a dubious assertion, and now with the events of the last 6 weeks or so, it's even more absurd. I mean, we've seen what happened when the Iraqi people were told they would be liberated by the United States and its allies invading and devastating and bombing them to smithereens. We saw a decade later when the US decided that it would intervene in the political struggle going on in Syria by beginning to arm dozens of different factions within the political struggle in Syria and help turn that struggle into something devastating for the country with, 12 million people displaced and horrendous levels of destruction. And we've seen, if those two examples of Iraq and Syria weren't enough, we've seen what's happened with claims that the goal of this current war of Israel and the US were aimed at regime change. They're not actually even capable of doing such a thing. They're capable of assassinating enormous numbers of people. And of course, something new, relatively speaking, about this is the openness with which the US and Israel go about programs of assassination, an assassination from the air, not sort of going in secretly and seeing if they can find somebody to sort of bump off, but assassination through massive aerial destruction. It's not new to want to try and assassinate the leaders of other countries, but just to sort of proclaim that openly as normal policy and somehow connect that to something called regime change. Of course, it was the new scale of this was pioneered in Gaza, and people had to lose their lives in the name of sort of regime change in Gaza, which even there failed. I think the thought that something called regime change can happen, not just by foreign intervention, but foreign intervention that now works through unprecedented levels of aerial bombardment and destruction, as it did in Iraq in 2003 and so on. People point to the example of Venezuela, and I think that just shows their naivety. I mean, first of all, there's been no regime change in Venezuela. The president has been abducted, but replaced with his vice president. And the people of Venezuela have suffered from the levels of embargo that have been placed on the country. But that as a model, and I'm sure Trump had it in mind, perhaps as a model that he could successfully just sort of somehow decapitate and perhaps impose some kinds of embargoes, and the outcome would be regime change. The absurdity of thinking of that as a parallel is almost beyond belief.
One of the ways in which one might read this situation is that it continues to be important for the West, and particularly Europe, one might say, to maintain authoritarian governments in the Gulf, in the Middle East, in order to maintain the flow of oil to Europe. So that's sort of one reading of your book, Carbon Democracy. But what I hear you saying today is that what's happening isn't so much an attempt to maintain these authoritarian governments in the Gulf in order to ensure the supply of oil, but in order to ensure the purchase of arms from places like the United States. it's become clear that the United States isn't dependent on oil in the way that perhaps Europe is. Could you, comment on that a little bit?
I think it's absolutely right to stress this link between oil wealth and arms purchases. And the UK, just as much as the US, is immorally dependent on the sale of weaponry to repressive regimes in the Gulf. And understanding the level of that and the significance of that to industries in the US, industries in the UK is really important at the level of repression. It's not about the supply of oil, because more democratic, more open regimes would be just as interested in selling their oil. Just as Iran itself, no particular friend of the UK or the US, is very interested in selling its oil to anybody who's buying. So it's not about securing the supply of oil, and it never has been. And you can see that both from the ease with which the US and Britain decide to go to war, knowing that will result in enormous interruptions to the supply of oil, but also because it's a question, now that those oil revenues go to the producer states rather than to the international oil companies, it's about what that oil money is spent on. And what that oil money is spent on is this weapons complex. And that, that needs to be kept in place, and it's kept in place by specific alliances with specific autocrats across the region. But it's equally kept in place by the production of the notion that somehow this region of the Gulf is defined by threats, is defined by some need to arm to the hilt every regime we can find that will take our arms. And that's, again, one of those myths that one needs to dispel to make better sense of the current situation. So the argument in Carbon Democracy was actually making a comparison between the history of the West and the history of oil in the Middle East. And what I suggested was that the emergence of mass democracy in the West, 100 years between 1870s and 1970s, depended absolutely on carbon energy. But it was a period when the main source of that carbon energy was coal, and that countries had this single source of energy in coal, and coal had to be brought out of the ground by workers and moved by workers on trains. It didn't go very far, but it gave those workers, for the first time in history, over that 100-year period, the opportunity to shut down a country's productive life, because all they had to do was interrupt that one source of energy. That changes, particularly from the mid-later 20th century, with the arrival of and the increasing dependence on a second source of carbon energy, oil. And the book was interested in how oil is different. It's, first of all, it's largely emerging in places that are a long way from where it's used. So you haven't got that tight energy system that can be easily shut down by workers. There's thousands of miles separating producers from consumers. And because people don't have to be sent underground to get it out, it moves in pipelines that are much easier, much more difficult to interrupt. So there's something about the very nature of the energy source that is different for producing more democratic forms of politics. But in addition, that's not to deny that oil workers in Iran, in Iraq, in Saudi Arabia, attempted to use their role in the production of a critical source of energy to force better forms of life, to go on strike. And the role of oil strikes in Iran in 1947-48, in Iraq in the same period, really, really critical. But what happens is, and the outcome is different, because those oil states are able to use that popular pressure that's represented through oil strikes and transform it into a demand for nationalization. And you see that's exactly what happens under Mossadegh. There's a national oil strike, and he says, yeah, we'd better nationalize the oil. Not we'd better see what all the demands of workers are for a better life, but if we nationalize the oil, our problems will be solved. And you get the oil nationalization of 1951 and the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953. But that's a general pattern where sort of demands for those improved social rights and pay and living conditions and working conditions, all those things that are the sort of building blocks of a more democratic order, are translated into this national control of oil. Once you have that national control of oil, the sort of power of sabotage that workers had under coal and briefly under oil is moved into the hands of the state. And the state can now decide, because it has nationalized the control of oil, to use that control, as it does, to vastly increase the price of oil, which is essentially what the 73 and subsequent oil embargoes are about. They get that increased price of oil, and then they can use that in two ways. First of all, as a system of repression, because they now have much more access to the kinds of funds it needs to repress movements of workers and other kinds of movements for more democratic forms of life. But something else happens, which was talking about earlier, which is that those funds are recycled into arms purchases. Mm-hmm. And so the interest of the West is no longer directly to control the supply of oil, because these, autocratic regimes are just as interested in selling their oil as when it was in the hands of
corporations.
Of corporations. And I think they understand that even more democratic regimes would be equally interested in selling the oil. But what they're now dependent on is that oil arms nexus, and creating the sort of security architecture in which oil money has to be spent on arms becomes just as important, if not more important, to the West than the actual supply of oil.
So the stress on the connection, as you said, the nexus between arms and oil is what sort of shifted in your thinking about the present moment.
Yeah, I think, that shifts at that period, and it just intensifies and intensifies. And, one of the things that intensifies to an extraordinary level is the sheer cost of those arms. I mean, back in those days, in, current sterling terms, a fighter jet might have cost, $10 million. Today it costs $100 million. And, even after adjusting for inflation. So the sheer amount of ability of the security complex of weapons purchases to sort of soak up this oil and then and recycle it into profits in the West. There's no comparison with the situation today between what it was 50 years ago, and that has shifted. My thinking has shifted, but the weapons complex has shifted too.
So what do you make of Donald Trump saying we just want the oil? It's always kind of brazen sort of admission of American colonialism.
I think it's interesting. I think the same thing happened with the Iraq War in 2003, that people were saying, it's really, on the left were saying it's really about the oil. They're trying to get the oil. And it was actually Paul Wolfowitz in the Pentagon who said, of course it's all about oil. Of course we need to secure the supply of oil. We're not stupid. It wasn't what it was about. But people can sort of say that. And if they're on the left, they think it's imperialism. And if they're on the right, they think, good, America's acting in its national interest, and securing its future supply of energy. Both understandings are wrong. It's not about oil. It's about all the other things we've been talking about.